So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you all see that? Does that look like a beaver? Yes, great. So this evening I'll be talking a bit about the idea of partnering with beavers to heal the planet, how we can work with these ingenious, creative animals to achieve various ecological goals. But I think before we get into what it means to work with beavers, it's important to establish a few basic beaver facts about what these animals are and how they make their living. So beavers, of course, are rodents. They're North America's largest rodent. Typical adult beaver is you're looking at usually 40 to 60 pounds. So they're quite a bit heftier, I think, than most people realize. Usually you just see them, cruising along with their head exposed and their mass submerged like an iceberg. And they're semi-aquatic rodents, which means they spend their whole lives in and around water. And they've got a number of incredible adaptations for this unique semi-aquatic niche they fill. They've got extraordinarily dense fur, one of the thickest pelts in the animal kingdom, which was their downfall, and we'll talk about that in a moment. They've got these wonderful webbed duck-like hind feet, so they're very powerful, agile swimmers, capable of remaining underwater for up to 15 minutes. They're champion breath holders. They've got a second set of eyelids, transparent eyelids known as nictitating membranes, which act as goggles underwater, as well as a second set of lips, kind of like a fur-lined valve that they can close behind their front teeth so they can chew and drag branches underwater without drowning. And then what's a beaver's most recognizable, iconic feature? Of course, it's that tail, right? And that tail serves a number of different functions. It's a rudder while they swim. It's a kickstand out on land. It's a fat storage device. So they actually put on fat for the winter in their tails. And it's an alarm system, right? I'm sure that many of you spent time around wetlands and heard the smack of a beaver's tail hitting the water, which they do to warn other beavers about the presence of predators. And the other great beaver feature that's worth highlighting are those teeth, right? Beavers' top and bottom incisors are self-sharpening, so they basically, grind each other down into these nice chisel-like points. And you'll notice that the teeth are orange, which is because they're chemically and structurally fortified with iron that beavers derive from their food. And of course, having these iron-reinforced teeth comes in handy when you spend your whole life cutting down trees, right? Beavers fell trees to eat the cambium, the inner bark. That's the kind of the sugary layer that does the growing. They'll take just about any deciduous tree. They do tend to avoid those conifers, but aspen, of course, is a famous beaver favorite. Willow, poplar, sugar maple. Again, they'll take just about anything deciduous. They also eat lots of green herbaceous vegetation as well, cattails, water lilies, submerged roots. I've seen them basically mow people's lawns for them. So they're what scientists call choosy generalists. They've got a few tree species that they prefer, but they'll eat just about anything. They are totally herbivorous, right? They don't eat fish at all. So in addition to cutting down trees to eat that inner bark, they're also using the wood as construction material. And there are a couple of basic types of beaver structure worth highlighting. The first is the lodge, right? That's the beaver housing unit. And in there, you typically have two to as many as 8 or so beavers. That's the male and the female, the monogamous mating pair. The kits, the newborn baby beavers, the 1-year-olds, and the 2-year-olds. So at times, you've got 3-year classes of offspring all cohabitating in that lodge, those older brothers and sisters kind of teaching their younger siblings, how to be a beaver. And then those 2-year-olds are the ones who disperse out like they're looking for their own territories, like they're heading off to beaver college. And so lodges come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Often you see these, kind of big freestanding island-like lodges. Probably more frequently, I see bank-attached lodges. And sometimes they'll just, very happily kind of tunnel into the river bank and have a bank lodge, which they cap with a bunch of sticks that basically act as a kind of a ventilation shaft. So just because you don't see a big, freestanding volcanic island doesn't mean there aren't beavers, living pretty inconspicuously and happily in the riverbank. And that's my dog Kit, which is what you call a baby beaver. So I'm truly, I really have a one-track mind. So of course, in addition to the lodge, the other famous beaver structure is the dam, right? So why do beavers do this? Why do beavers build dams? What's the point of that weird, unique, specialized behavior that nothing else in the animal kingdom besides us really does? Well, a beaver out on land, as one biologist put it to me, is basically a fat, slow, smelly meat package, right? And beavers get eaten by, here in Colorado, we've got cougars and wolves, and of course, you guys have black bears and coyotes. Any large carnivore is going to try to eat a beaver. So by building that dam and expanding and deepening that pool of water, beavers are basically engineering their own shelter. They're creating their own security. So instead of having to walk overland to that good-looking aspen stand and risk being eaten by a wolf along the way, they can swim as close as possible to it instead and just minimize their time out of the water. So beaver dams come in like lodges. They come in all kinds of shapes and sizes. I just love this, beautiful kind of perfect radial arc, near my home in Colorado. You can see they're actually using a lot of rock in their dams, which I think most people don't realize. But they move some pretty large rocks in their front paws, kind of waddling on their hind feet, which is always adorable to see. Typical colony is building one big primary dam, and then a number of smaller secondary dams. So often you'll see, up to a dozen or so dams on certain streams. I think it's worth noting too that beavers don't have to build dams, right? They're building those dams to expand and create that aquatic shelter, that pool. But if they're living in a big body of water already, then they're perfectly content, right? There are plenty of beavers in, the Hudson River and Lake Champlain, living very happily in the banks, not needing or not being able to build a dam. Just because you don't see a beaver dam, again, doesn't mean there aren't plenty of beavers around. And when they're left to their own devices, they can do some pretty impressive stuff. This is a beaver dam in northern Minnesota that I visited. That's about 15 feet high and 600 or so feet long. It's obviously the work of many successive generations of beavers all adding their stick to the pile. So that's not necessarily typical of what beavers do, but it's the kind of thing they can do in a protected area like Voyageurs National Park in Minnesota. And I'm always really impressed by their hydrologic savvy, right? I feel like if you took an engineer from the Army Corps and put her on a stream and said, okay, build a dam that minimizes labor and maximizes the total impoundment, she'd put the dam exactly where the beavers do, right? So here's a single 300-acre beaver pond, also in Minnesota, created by one strategically placed dam at the little kind of narrow constriction point in a canyon. So they're pretty good hydrologists. The other beaver feature that we don't talk enough about, I think, are their canals. Beavers are, of course, prolific builders, but they're also prolific excavators, and they dig these elaborate canal networks that spiderweb up into the forest, so they can, again, swim up those canals, cut down those aspen or willow, float them on back out to the lodge or out to the pond, all while minimizing their time out of the water. And that ends up being a really important way that beavers are moving water across the landscape. And you'll often look at those canals and see, tadpoles or juvenile fish in there. Those end up being pretty good little habitat features. So beavers are doing all this stuff. They're building dams, they're creating ponds, they're digging canals, and they're doing it all to maximize their own security and shelter. But in the process, they're creating habitat for lots of other creatures as well, right? Beavers are what scientists call a keystone species, and that term comes from architecture. The top block in a stone arch is the keystone. And if you pull that block out, the whole arch crumbles, right? And keystone species like beavers are similarly holding up a lot of weight in ecosystems. I'm sure many of you are birders. Well, where do you go looking for birds or other wildlife in wetlands, of course. And any animal that's capable of building and creating and expanding wetlands ends up being really important. Here in the American West where I live, wetlands cover about 2% of land area and support around 80% of biodiversity. And you guys have more wetlands in Vermont than we have here in Colorado, certainly. But the same logic applies. Beavers are creating these incredibly productive habitats. And it's almost hard to name a species that doesn't benefit from beavers to some extent. But certainly we know that wading birds and waterfowl and passerines, songbirds are very happy kind of perching in those coppiced willows and feeding on aquatic insects emerging off the beaver pond. Here's a great blue heron rookery in a beaver pond here in Colorado. So again, those water birds are of course huge beaver beneficiaries. We know that other semi-aquatic mammals, muskrat, otter, mink, moose, love hanging out in beaver ponds. If you were going to overlay beaver habitat and moose habitat, you'd have the exact same places, right? Amphibians are prolific beaver pond breeders. In Vermont, of course, you've got wood frogs and peepers and all kinds of cool stuff. Out here in Colorado, our amphibian of primary concern is the boreal toad. And something like 90% of boreal toad breeding occurs in beaver ponds. That's basically a beaver pond obligate, right? So, those are all the kind of like these peer-reviewed connections that you would find in a scientific journal. But, beaver interactions get a lot stranger and more surprising than that. Here's one neat example. This is in again, northern Minnesota in Voyageurs National Park. Beavers occupied this giant lodge for a long time. Then they left the area. The pond drained. You get this kind of lush, wet meadow that was, really good browse for moose and deer and other animals. But in this case, this lodge was basically stranded high and dry. And here, a pack of wolves actually moved into that lodge and raised their pups in the lodge. So that's beavers creating habitat for their direct predator. Pretty wild. Another neat beaver interaction, and this is like the great thing about beaver ponds, right? Is you just can't go to a beaver site and not see something weird or cool or interesting or surprising. So a couple of years ago, I was at a kind of a series of beaver ponds in Utah with a friend. We saw a sandhill crane walking along the top of the beaver dam. I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. I've never seen a crane in a beaver pond before. So I took a picture, and later on, I zoomed in on the crane's feet and realized that she'd actually built a nest and laid a clutch of 2 eggs directly atop that beaver dam, which kind of acts like a kind of a predator-proof island out in that pond. So there's always something cool to observe. One quick Vermont-specific anecdote. Years ago, I was in Vermont with Skip Lyle, inventor of the beaver deceiver, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. But we were at this pond that he showed me, and there, beavers had, of course, cut a bunch of trees down, opened up the forest canopy, let light hit the forest floor, and there was all of this jewelweed and Joe Pye weed and other wildflowers growing, and there were dozens of hummingbirds that had come to feed on those flowers. And again, there's like, I've never seen a peer-reviewed scientific paper about beavers stimulating hummingbird production, but you go to these sites and there's always something fascinating to observe. So next time you're at a beaver pond, look out for hummingbirds because that's another cool beaver beneficiary. And then from a management perspective, probably the most important beaver connection is with fish, right? Juvenile salmonids. This is a juvenile steelhead, which is basically a rainbow trout that goes to the ocean like a salmon. Of course, in Vermont, you guys have brook trout as your iconic native salmonid. And if you're a juvenile trout, you don't want to live in the free-flowing, fast-moving main stem river, right? You're just going to get blown downstream. What you want is a side channel or an eddy or a deep pool or some brushy cover where you can take shelter from kingfishers or herons, right? You want that complex, slow water refuge habitat, which is exactly what beavers create. So there are a million scientific papers demonstrating that beavers enhance fish production. I've talked to many anglers, including plenty in Vermont, who say, yeah, I caught the biggest brook trout of my life in a beaver pond. Right? These animals are creating these incredible fish refuges. Of course, the objection that you do hear sometimes from anglers and occasionally fish biologists is, wait a second, we're trying to take dams out of streams and rivers right now, right? We don't want to put more dams into rivers and create blockages to fish passage. Why do we want these dam building rodents around? But of course, a beaver dam is nothing like a big human-built concrete dam. Fish have all kinds of ways of getting over and through and around beaver dams. I've seen them wriggle through the woody structure. Oftentimes, fish are migrating during periods of high flow when there's water going over the top of beaver dams or around on the floodplain. This is more anecdote than scientific evidence, but cool nonetheless. This is a beaver pond just outside of Seattle. Here's the upstream, or the downstream rather, beaver dam. Here's the upstream pond, and here are the two freshly excavated coho salmon nests. Right, so at least two fish had no problem whatsoever getting past that beaver dam. And in fact, beavers and fish, these are animals that have been on the landscape together for at least 8 million years. There's a deep evolutionary connection there, which inspired my favorite bumper sticker, which is "Beavers taught salmon to jump." I think that gets at it nicely. So, we've been talking about fish and birds and, toads and wolves. What do beavers do for us humans that we might care about? And not that that's, the most important measure of a species necessarily, but, it's a good argument to be able to make, right? That these are animals that are providing all kinds of ecological services and benefits that we humans enjoy. And the list of beaver services is long, but here in the West where I live and increasingly all over the planet, we're becoming hotter and drier, right? And as we get hotter and drier due to climate change, we lose our snowpack, that gradual snow melt that's so important for feeding our rivers and streams and irrigation ditches all summer long. So without that snowpack on the landscape, we need a different way of keeping water in our mountains. And guess what? Here's this nifty little rodent that builds thousands of reservoirs for us up in the high country, right? So here's a neat example of that. This is the headwaters of the Roaring Fork River, which is a tributary to the Colorado River. And of course, you've all read about the Colorado River, this iconic Western river that's going dry and is overdrawn and messed up by climate change. This is at about 12,000 feet in elevation above sea level, by the way. So they really get way the heck up there into the mountains. And you can just see, this stream just comes winding along, through this valley, and then it hits all of these linear features, right? These beaver dams, which create ponds and store that water in the valley, so that there's still water gradually trickling downstream all throughout the summer and fall. And I think a really important point to note about beaver ponds is that there's the visible, when you look at a beaver pond, there's the visible surface water, right? All the water that you see. What you don't see is the water that, as it spreads out laterally onto the floodplain, soaks into the ground, recharges those aquifers, moves downstream underground very slowly, and then percolates back up through the stream bed. There's often 5 to 10 times as much water storage underground at a beaver pond as there is in surface water. So they're fantastic little drought mitigators and climate adapters. Of course, in Vermont and elsewhere in New England, your problem isn't necessarily drought so much as it is flooding, right? You're getting these increasingly intense precipitation events with climate change, and there too, beavers have a role to play in controlling floods. And I think that's a little bit counterintuitive, right? We think about beavers as these animals who cause flooding, not prevent it. But you've got a big pulse of runoff racing downstream, tearing out banks and damaging houses. And then it hits that beaver pond complex, all of those dams and wetlands, and that water spreads out onto the floodplain, sinks into the ground, is captured in the pond itself. There have been individual studies showing that individual beaver colonies, a single family of beavers on a creek, can capture around 30% of big rain events in those streams. So beavers are, fantastic agents of flood control. This is a beaver pond in Scotland that I visited, where Eurasian beavers, the close cousins to our North American beavers, are being reintroduced largely for their flood control benefits. So, I think I think it's worth taking a second to just pause and contemplate kind of the magic of beavers, right? We've got these two polar opposite problems, drought and flooding, different ends of the hydrograph, and beavers are helping us tackle both of them by stabilizing those flows. I think that's kind of amazing to contemplate. Beavers are great irrigators, right? Again, they're spreading water on the floodplain, soaking water into the ground, raising that water table, and growing plants, right? And that's a big deal for for guys like this. This is James Rogers, a rancher I've met out in Nevada, who has really embraced beavers, and as James pointed out, beavers are increasing grass production about tenfold for him by again irrigating those pastures. So he's a guy whose dad shot beavers and whose dad's dad shot beavers, but he's embracing these critters because he's seen the kind of benefits they can provide, and I'm sure you could find dairy farmers in Vermont who feel the same way. They're also fantastic pollution capturers, right? Streams racing along, it's carrying nitrates and phosphates from agriculture and maybe heavy metals from historic mining, certainly an issue here in Colorado, and herbicides, pesticides, and then it hits that beaver pond, it slows down, it loses its kinetic energy, and all of those suspended solids settle out, right, and are captured in many subsequent layers of sediment. There have been studies showing that beavers are capable of capturing up to 45% of the excess nitrogen in some watersheds. So these are fantastic little pollution filterers, and they're great carbon sequesterers, right? All of that organic matter, you can see that big kind of cake of sediment that's just rich in sticks and leaves and insect bodies and all kinds of stuff. There have been studies basically finding that beaver wetlands can capture about as much carbon as an equivalent area of old growth forest, right? So these are again some fantastic carbon sequesterers. And then the final really wonderful benefit that's worth highlighting. That's really a big reason that beavers are kind of a hot topic right now, no pun intended. Here in the West at least, is they're great firefighters, right? Water doesn't burn, and beavers, by spreading water out and turning those dry brown plants into lush green ones, basically create these fantastic fire breaks on the landscape, right? This is the Sharps Fire in Idaho a few years ago. Uplands are burnt to a crisp, and the last green, wet, blue, lush place on the landscape is that beaver-influenced valley bottom, right? So beavers are great firefighters, and in fact, Emily Fairfax, a cool beaver scientist, has proposed that the U.S. Forest Service change its mascot from Smokey Bear to Smokey Beaver. I like that idea. So how many beavers do we have in North America today? How are these critters doing? The answer is we don't really know what our beaver population is right now. Probably 10 to 15 million is the best guess, which, sounds pretty good. But then you start to wonder, well, wait a second, how many beavers did we have? How many beavers were on the landscape at the time of European arrival in North America? And again, we don't really know, but the best guess is that there were as many as 400 million beavers in North America prior to European contact. I think personally, I think that hundreds of millions is a pretty safe guess. I would err on the high side of that estimate. But there have been more recent, peer-reviewed papers finding that there are around 200 million beaver ponds in North America, which, a little bit of back of the envelope math tells you would have impounded something like 230,000 square miles, which, for reference, is about the size of Arizona and Nevada put together, right? So that's how much land was underwater thanks to these amazing animals. And I think it's important to note that the idea that beavers are good and important and beneficial, that's not a new concept to Western science, right? That's something that Native people have understood for a very long time in North America. Tribes like the Blackfeet had a kind of a cultural prohibition against killing beavers and considered beavers sacred. Because as Rosalind Lapierre, a great Blackfeet historian, pointed out, they recognized that beavers created these ecological oases in an otherwise dry landscape, right? So this idea that, again, beavers are beneficial is something that Western science is kind of rediscovering, but that Native people have known for a really long time. So one of the things that I tried to do when I was working on my book about beavers was just figure out what a fully beavered North America would have looked like. What was this continent like when we had several hundred million beavers? And I think there's no question that it was a much greener, wetter, bluer, lusher place with its full complement of beavers. You go back through old historical records, trappers' journals, explorers' diaries, railroad surveys, and you see these incredible accounts of explorers crossing what is today Indiana, for example, and not finding a dry place to camp for 100 miles because beavers had just ponded everything up. Lewis and Clark going up the Missouri River described seeing beaver dams and ponds in every single tributary as far as the eye can see, all the way up to the mountains. In fact, in some places, the Corps of Discovery had to walk along the ridge lines because those valley bottoms were so thoroughly ponded up by beavers. So that was in 1805 that Lewis and Clark saw beavers as far as the eye can see up to the mountains. In 1843, just 38 years later, John James Audubon, of course, the naturalist and painter, traveled the exact same route, right? Looking for a beaver to paint. He was kind of off of birds and on this mammal kick. And he couldn't find a single beaver in the entirety of the Missouri Basin, where they'd been ubiquitous just 38 years earlier. So where did beavers go in under 4 decades? What happened to them? What did they turn into? Well, the answer, of course, is hats, right? I think we hear the phrase beaver hat and think of like a big, fluffy Davy Crockett type of thing, but in fact, beaver hats were these sort of elegant, quasi-Victorian top hats that were all the rage in Europe. And the industrial fur trade really begins in the late 1500s, early 1600s in New England, and spreads pretty rapidly west and south across the continent. Trappers and traders just wiping beavers out from every river, lake, stream, and wetland they encounter. And it's hard to overstate the extent to which the fur trade drove early American history, right? Along with timber and cod and gold, pelts were really the most important resource that Europeans found in North America. And practically every significant event prior to the Civil War has some kind of beaver connection. The American Revolution, one of the British offenses that angered the colonists was denying them access to trapping grounds west of the Appalachians. The Louisiana Purchase, that was partly fueled by Jefferson's desire to secure new places to trap. And of course, it was those white trappers and traders who spread smallpox and other diseases that ravaged many native tribes, right? So the story of the fur trade is really the story of early American history and all of its kind of grandeur and tragedy. In addition to being a hugely significant historical event, the fur trade was also a profound ecological event, right? I mean, what happens when you kill several hundred million beavers? Well, all of those beaver dams break down and those ponds drain to the ocean. And it's this tremendous loss of habitat for all of the animals we were talking about, brook trout and moose and wood ducks. This is really the aquatic dust bowl in a lot of ways, this profound change to the North American landscape that, really was incredibly detrimental to so many species. So, by 1900 or so, the beaver population in North America has kind of reached its nadir. We've gone from several hundred million beavers to maybe 100,000 or so, pretty much all of them up in Canada. Beavers are functionally extinct in the lower 48. But in the early 1900s, all of these states and government agencies start to realize that, hey, live beavers are more valuable than dead ones, right? These are pretty nifty critters, and let's get them back on the landscape. Interestingly, Vermont's beavers came from New York. New York reintroduced beavers in the Adirondacks in 1906. Using stock from Canada and Yellowstone National Park, and those New York beavers just reproduced wildly and kind of repopulated Vermont. So, there are probably some people on this webinar who have some antipathy towards New Yorkers, but you can thank New York for your beavers. Of course, probably the most famous beaver reintroduction occurred in Idaho in the 1940s. This is maybe something you guys have heard of, but at that time, Idaho basically wanted to return beavers to what is today the Frank Church Wilderness area. And at first, they tried moving the beavers on horseback. The horses didn't take very kindly to having these big, smelly rodents strapped to them. But it was 1948. It was just post World War II. There were all of these surplus parachutes and airplanes on hand. And so one of these Idaho fish and game biologists had the bright idea of dropping beavers out of airplanes, putting them in these special crates strapped to parachutes and chucking them out of these planes. So they dropped 76 beavers out of planes in 1948. 75 of the beavers survived. One beaver, unfortunately, escaped from the crate midair and fell to his death. Very sad. But the next year, when they flew back over that area, they actually saw new ponds and wetlands in all of the places where they'd airdropped beavers. So at the time, this was a pretty successful reintroduction strategy. Nobody's throwing beavers out of airplanes today, but that's how it was done in the 40s. So, all throughout the mid 20th century to today, really, beavers are increasing their numbers and their range, right? They're returning to all of these places where they used to live, and then we trap them out. There's only one problem, which is that in their absence, we've colonized all of those places, right? It turns out that good beaver habitat and good human habitat is basically one and the same. We both like broad, fertile floodplains and low gradient stream corridors. That's where we build their dams, and or that's where they build their dams, and that's where we build our roads and railroads and power lines and homes and other infrastructure, right? And I'd argue that we're the nuisance species more than they are, but there's no question that when beavers and humans overlap, conflicts can ensue, right? So here's one example of that. This is a little cabin that I stumbled upon in New Mexico. That, as you can see, beavers have totally flooded out. And I just like this picture because what you can sort of see in this image is that, so the beavers actually begin their dam in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. They dam up to the base of the cabin. Then they include the cabin in the dam, and they keep going on the right-hand side of the screen, right? So, you wouldn't want to be that landowner necessarily, but you have to admire the ingenuity of those beavers. Here's probably the most common source of beaver conflict, right, is damming and road culverts. If you're a beaver, the road bed is like the world's greatest dam, and the culvert, that pipe that funnels the stream under the road, that's the leak in the dam, right? And beavers plug leaks. That's what they do. So the water rises, the road washes out. Big time consuming, expensive, potentially dangerous headache to maintain. So that's probably the most common source of beaver conflict, but they get into all kinds of interesting mischief. Here's a beaver that broke into a dollar store in Maryland and was browsing the plastic Christmas tree aisle when it was apprehended by the authorities. And I just was happy to see recently The Onion had a fun little beaver satire. More Americans moving away from urban areas for rural life, where they have escalating feud with beaver. I just felt like that was your issue has made it when it's in The Onion, right? I was excited about that. So the way that we virtually always handle these sorts of beaver conflicts is by killing the offending beaver, right? And that makes a certain amount of sense. The beaver's causing a problem, get the beaver out of there. Every year, the federal government kills around 25,000 beavers, the Department of Wildlife Services, and certainly private nuisance trappers kill many, many tens, if not hundreds of thousands more. And although I understand the logic there, It's flawed for a couple of reasons. First, of course, when you kill those beavers, you're also eliminating that great pond and wetland habitat we care about. But also, all you're doing is putting up a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as that culvert is still there, beckoning to them, they're always going to come back, and that problem is just going to keep recurring. And there are communities all over the country, including many in Vermont, who are engaged in this very, expensive, and I would argue inhumane and ecologically nonsensical treadmill of trapping and recolonization and trapping and recolonization. So you start to wonder, well, maybe there are better ways of solving these beaver problems rather than killing the offending animals, right? How can we, deal with these issues a little smarter? Um, One option, in some states is relocation, right? Live trapping beavers and moving them, into places where there are no beavers. That's not really a very popular option, especially in New England. But mostly because it's just hard to find an unoccupied territory. Beavers are very territorial animals, and you don't want to move them on top of each other. But also, when you relocate beavers, you're not really solving that problem, right? You're moving them, but again, you're not addressing that culvert that's still going to just recur and recur. So let's figure out ways to live with these animals instead, right? How can we coexist with beavers? So in the U.S., lots of beavers get killed for cutting down trees, right? Fruit trees or ornamental trees. And I just don't think that any beaver should ever be killed for cutting down a tree. That's just too easy a problem to solve with a bit of heavy gauge wire fencing that deters them from chewing. So here's just one nice case study from here in Salida, Colorado, where the city had these beautiful old cottonwood trees that it wanted to protect from beavers. So it fenced off those cottonwood trees, and then it left unfenced the non-native Siberian elm trees, which the beavers took down. So that's invasive vegetation management using a beaver as your agent. I think that's a neat example of the kind of creative problem solving we can accomplish when we don't just reflexively turn to lethal trapping. When the issue is flooding, that can be a more difficult problem to solve. But there too, we've got great options, right? This guy is Skip Lyle, inventor of the beaver deceiver, and basically a whole bunch of other products, all of which are sort of accomplishing the same thing, which is just preventing beavers from plugging up culverts and messing up human infrastructure, right? And Skip's products are part of this broader category of contraptions called flow devices. They all kind of work the same way. And the idea is that you take one of those pipes, run the pipe through the beaver dam or into the road culvert. So you're just moving water from the upstream side to the downstream side, right? You're just dropping the level of that pond to a point that both beavers and humans can tolerate. And then you've got those cages there so that beavers don't plug up those pipe ends, because they will do that if you give them a chance to. So you're just striking a balance, right? You're dropping the level of that flooding to a point where both humans and beavers can tolerate it. Here's Mike Callahan, who's based in Southampton, Massachusetts. Mike is, one of Skip's kind of proteges and is now the founder of the Beaver Institute. Here's kind of a classic culvert protection fence, right? That just keeps the beavers out of there. You go in there once or twice a year, get all of the debris and sticks off of it. And, it's kind of a set it and more or less forget it type of thing. Mike has found that those kinds of devices, these flow devices are basically 87 to 97% effective. No question, there are thousands and thousands of sites all over the country where we're currently killing beavers, but could be coexisting with them instead. In fact, there have also been cool studies of Skip's beaver deceivers. There's a great study in Virginia, which basically found that every dollar you spend on one of Skip's products returns more than $8 in avoided trapping and road maintenance costs, right? So these sorts of non-lethal solutions, yes, they're good for beavers, but they're also good for government agencies and their bottom lines. Another neat beaver restoration technique that we see a lot out here in the American West, but increasingly in New England and states like Maryland as well, is beaver mimicry, right? Building beaver dam analogs, which are basically human-built beaver dams. And the idea there is basically by putting in an artificial beaver dam, you can basically pond up some water, create a bit of structure and just direct where beavers colonize and settle. And you're kind of creating a little beaver Kickstarter, right, and just guiding their activity. And the place where this idea of beaver mimicry was really pioneered was in Oregon in the early 2000s, where scientists built around 115 of these beaver dam analogs, these artificial beaver dams. The beavers kind of went gangbusters and built 120 dams of their own. The inundated area more than doubled, right? So beavers and humans, all of those dams just spreading water out onto the floodplain, filling up all of these old side channels and wetlands and marshes, and just creating lots of kind of messy, complex pond and side channel habitat, and all of those new habitat areas led to more than a 50% increase in the survival of juvenile steelhead, right? Those little rainbow trout. So that's humans and beavers kind of working together to enhance the recovery of a federally threatened fish. I think that's kind of a neat case study. And again, you can see this sort of thing all over the Northeast now as well. And here's just one neat little example of human beaver collaboration. This is from a stream not too far from my home in Colorado, and I think that most people would look at this sort of stream, this little meandering sine wave moving through the valley, and say, hey, that looks pretty good, right? That's a healthy stream. There's nothing wrong with that picture. You could catch plenty of brook trout in there, but the Forest Service and some private stream restoration firms basically said, hey, I think we can do better. I think this stream is not maximizing its potential, and it could use some restoration. So this is what the stream looked like in 2021 before this restoration project began. In 2022, Ecometrics, this stream restoration firm, built around 40 of those beaver dam analogs, right? Those artificial beaver dams. So you went from this to this. You can see, some of these little ponds are starting to widen a little bit. There's some water being impounded in that valley, which is good. But the next year, the beavers showed up, right? Attracted by all of those human-built starter dams, and they just went crazy. So just keep this picture in mind, and then check out this, where every single one of these red lines is a different beaver-built dam. You can just see how much water is being spread onto the floodplain, how many ponds and wetlands and marshes are being created, how much water is, again, soaking into the ground and, raising the water table and recharging those aquifers. And I think one of the incredible things about beavers is that they change our conception of what a stream can be, right? Again, I think most of us would look at something like this and say, yeah, that looks pretty good. But in reality, the stream corridor, that area that the stream is capable of occupying is so much wider, and beavers accomplish that. They take those little narrow threads of water and just spread it everywhere. And as we've been talking about, that's just good for so many reasons. So, given all that, why do we still persecute beavers so much? We know that they provide all of these wonderful services. Why do we still kill tens and tens of thousands of them every single year, including plenty in Vermont? And I think that part of it comes down to this phenomenon that you might call ecological amnesia. The idea that when we killed several 100 million beavers during the industrial fur trade, we changed streams in ways we don't totally understand, and we internalized this idea of a healthy aquatic ecosystem being this free-flowing, fast-moving, single-thread, cobble-bottomed channel. And look, this is a lovely stream, right? You could catch a brook trout here. You might see this sort of thing in a fly fishing catalog, but in reality, so many of our aquatic ecosystems looked like this instead, right? And this is I think in some ways a harder sort of aquatic ecosystem to love. The bottom is all mucky, and there are dead and dying trees everywhere, and it all kind of smells like decomposition. There's not even really a stream here, right? Like, where is the stream channel? You don't even really see it, and so. But we know that this sort of system is historically, in so many places, more rule than exception, and is in so many ways far healthier than that overly simplified model of what a stream should be. So, if we're going to fully embrace beavers, we have to reconfigure our historical imaginations and think again about what these systems should look like. So to sum it all up, we have this wonderful animal that provides all of these ecological benefits and services for us and for other species, does it all for free, and best of all, it doesn't need permits. That's really nice, right? So as the mantra of the beaver believer goes, let's get out of the way and let the rodent do the work. I like that idea. Briefly, I'll say, I've had another newish book out about the science of road ecology called Crossings, which is basically the study of how roads and nature interact and how we heal those sorts of interactions with wildlife crossing structures and other interventions. Anybody in Moncton, Vermont, you get that town's famous amphibian culvert gets a nice shout out. So if you're an ecologically minded person, that book might interest you. But we're here to talk about beavers, and I'm happy to take a few questions if we have time for it. So thank you all so much for being here, and thanks again, Marcy, for inviting me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Ben. That was awesome. We would love if you have questions, if you want to just type them in the chat, and then I will ask Ben and he will answer whatever you want to know. Um,
It's a big promise. I'll try. Or you can just raise your hand too. We can do it that way as well if that's easier for
Might as
folks.
well.
Yeah,
Lonnie,
Lonnie, you're.
I think you can unmute if you. Okay, now you should be able to. Sorry.
Oh, that's better. Um, I think my question is there was one part that you talked about how another country was using beavers to a positive benefit. What about the rest of the world? How do they feel about beavers? Are there beavers in the rest of the world?
Yes, certainly. So there are two species of beaver. There's castor fiber, or Castor canadensis, the North American beaver, and there's castor fiber, that's the Eurasian beaver, whose range was historically Western Europe to the Korean Peninsula, basically. And those beavers had kind of a similar trajectory. Basically wiped out. Or virtually wiped out by 1900. And they've also made a fantastic recovery. That now there are beavers in virtually every Western European country. Germany and France are probably the two most beavery European countries. There have been some restoration efforts in Mongolia as well. So yeah, I mean, they're again similar benefits to beaver restoration. Lots of people interested in fish recovery, helping to bring beavers back. I mentioned Scotland. And certainly the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, all engaged in beaver restoration, largely for reasons of flood control, which is a big issue in the rainy British Isles. So yeah, the castor fiber, the Eurasian beaver is doing okay and increasing its population all the time. Beavers were just spotted in Italy for the first time in 500 years, so it's exciting.
All right. Let's see. Questions from the chat. Um, Someone asked about stopping beaver trapping in Vermont or elsewhere. That's not really
Yeah,
your area necessarily, but
yeah. Yeah, certainly. As a lot of the state of Vermont is in the process, I think, of revising a lot of its beaver policies and regulations. They've taken testimony from lots of folks, including myself. So I don't know. I'll kind of stay out of that one, but I'm sure there are people on this call who are engaged in in beaver advocacy and activism in Vermont. And if you're involved in that issue, just pop it in the chat. Yeah, but yeah, I'll say that. I mean, to me, I'll just say very briefly that I do think that that beaver trapping, certainly an issue. Pelt trapping. I mean, to me, the lower hanging fruit is the nuisance trapping, right? All of those places where we're killing beavers in culverts and next to soccer fields and that sort of thing. Because I mean, so many of those conflicts really can be solved non-lethally. I think I think that the way that I always feel like tackling the nuisance trapping first and foremost is the right direction.
Beth Cole, you have your hand raised if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, I'm Jerry.
Oh,
Hi.
Jerry.
It's okay. Beth is right here off camera. I'm a professional wildlife photographer, and right now I'm hooked on beavers. I can't get enough of them. Live in Vermont. We live in Vermont, and I guess my question is, what's the best way that we can go about changing the attitude of fish and wildlife uh, here in the state? I would love to see not one more beaver lose its life. What can we do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think that well, look, I mean, I think that there are different levels of of government to engage, right? I mean, it's certainly changing the state's beaver policies is important, but I think it's also important to change county policies and municipal policies. And here in the county where I live, Chaffey County, until recently there was an informal beaver bounty on beavers, in culverts, right? You killed a beaver and you got a $50 pelt, and that was a policy that was were able to change with a couple of phone calls. I think it's in some ways it's easier changing that those local regulations than it is those statewide ones. And so that's not to discourage work at the state level, but just to say that the fate of beavers can really be this hyper local issue. And there are so many great stories of towns was it Andover, New Hampshire, that basically embraced flow devices and hired Skip Lyle to do a bunch of beaver coexistence. I mean, those I think that in some ways those yeah, those municipal and county governments are good levels at which to work, where a single meeting or well placed phone call can make a big difference. I don't know. I just dodged your question, but I
There are questions that don't always, unfortunately, have great answers. I would also say, at least just from my organization's perspective, is that you know, you folks as neighbors to other people also have a lot of power. And so trying to have conversations with your neighbors who are potentially, not seeing the upside of having beavers on their landscape or having beavers in their backyard, but as Ben sort of said, reducing those sort of like nuisance situations where we're just getting rid of them because somebody's unhappy that they're on their stream on their land. And so I think neighbors talking to neighbors also has a lot of power, and just trying to tell your neighbors why it's a great idea to have them in our ecosystems. Uh, Interesting question. Have you followed up Eager with any follow-up stories, including specific examples or stories beyond what you wrote in the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, look, I would certainly say that so Eager was published in 2018, and the since then, just the kind of the profusion of beaver restoration work has just been kind of mind blowing. I mean, I felt like when I was writing the book in 2016 and 17, you could sort of like reasonably talk to everyone working on beaver issues in the U.S. and now that would be just completely impossible. I mean, every week I learn about a new beaver project. somewhere in the country. So it's yeah, I mean it's a few examples of that. There's lots of beaver work happening in Georgia now. Where beavers are sort of being deployed to capture urban stormwater runoff. Lots of beaver restoration in Montana to remediate old historic mining waste, which is really exciting. And then the big story too that was just not really quite happening at scale, when I wrote this book. But Maryland has gone, has really become, I would say, the East Coast's beaver restoration leader, mostly to keep agricultural pollution out of Chesapeake Bay. So yeah, lots of exciting things have happened in the last 7 years, and a lot more are on the way.
And who knows, maybe a follow-up book.
Maybe not about beavers. I think one beaver book in a lifetime is the perfect number of beaver books.
I have a question here from someone who's saying they learned from a forestry professor that otters are the predominant predators of beavers in Massachusetts. Do you know if it's similar in Vermont, or have you heard of any other evidence of otter predation of beavers?
Yeah, otters do they do occasionally kill beaver kits. That does happen. I don't know about predominant predator. I've never quite heard that. I would say that in New England, the predominant predator of beavers is probably coyotes. I don't think coyotes take a ton of full-grown adult beavers, but those dispersing juveniles, coyotes they do take those. Yeah, I talked to a professor in the Adirondacks who'd looked at that issue and basically found increasing rates of coyote predation on beavers over time. So do otters kill some kits? Yeah, I do think that happens. But I would be surprised if they were really the predominant predator.
Another interesting question. What is the main factor preventing beaver populations from increasing? Is it trapping or something else?
Yeah, I would say, it's probably a combination of things. It's certainly trapping. Certainly, I mean, that again, that nuisance trapping, right? I keep coming back to that, but I certainly think that's an obstacle in the way of increasing beaver populations. These animals, they create their own habitat, they reproduce quickly, they're really good at increasing their numbers if we don't kill them, right? So I do think that nuisance trapping is a really big one. And then it's also just like land use, right? I mean, as I said earlier, we've taken a lot of the best habitat, and as we continue to grow and spread and occupy riparian areas, we're kind of squeezing these animals out to some extent. So a combination of protecting beavers and protecting space for beavers, I think that's really those are the it's easy that's easy to say, but I think those are the answers.
If there are any other questions, if you want to use the raise hand function, we can call on you.
I think I just wanted to say one other thing about because I think that the Coles and some others have sort of brought up the idea of right, how do we convince the state to reduce beaver trapping? And to me, I think that that just demonstrating those flood control benefits end up really being important. There's been some great work out of Wisconsin, basically quantifying beavers' ability to prevent floods and save public property and save the public money. And I know that's been influential in getting Wisconsin and the city of Milwaukee to kind of think differently about beavers. And just emphasizing those ecosystem benefits. And in Vermont, I know that flood control is a big one. Here in Colorado, where our state's become very pro beaver, it's drought, right, and wildfire. And so finding those ecological benefits and communicating those values, I think that's powerful.
John Lambert, you have your hand raised. I don't think
You're
you're
muted.
yeah.
There you go. Sorry. Thank you very much. I love your presentation. I'm a beaver believer also. Um, and I think how can we get people to communities have problems with, I'm in Charlestown on the Vermont border, and we have rural area that gets roads washed out because of beaver dams, and the municipality just traps or kills the beaver. And my wife, who's very environmentally conscious and beaver believer, would educate people on the benefit of what Skip Lyle does. He does an amazing job. He guarantees it, and he has saved communities thousands of dollars by putting his deceiver in. Anyway, I'm trying to build beaver dam analogs, and I don't know if you know a Vermont resident who works with the Upper Valley Land Trust called Hilaire Diamond. She's put in over a dozen of them. She was written up in Northern Woodland News a year and a half ago about her success. I'm trying to replicate that in New Hampshire because I'm all about slowing the water flow down to let it soak in, and the biological effects of that are huge. I put a link to an organization I'm a director on, bioforclimate.org, in my chat. I suggest you look at that.
Thanks.
Have you had any opportunity to build beaver dam analogs, and how do you get the permitting for that? Because DES is not cooperative in New Hampshire.
And the Army Corps of Engineers is in Vermont on board.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've certainly taken part in BDA construction projects in other states. Every state has its own permitting process, so I can't really, speak knowledgeably about, about the process in New Hampshire or Vermont. So, Skip would be a good person to talk to about that. I'm sure he can point you in the right direction.
Okay.
Might point out the Army Corps of Engineers.
Do we have any other questions? I think the only other thing I would love for you to share, Ben, is just you told me a little bit about it, but sort of how did you end up as someone who was not a beaver scientist, so into this issue and writing a book about it?
Yeah, let's see. I mean, again, I grew up in New York and spent a lot of time, in the Catskills and Adirondacks, and was always kind of around beavers and had a baseline appreciation and affection for them. And then in 2014, I was living in Seattle at the time, and working as a journalist, looking for things to write about and cover. And somebody sent me a flyer for a beaver workshop, and I had no idea what that was or what that entailed, but it sounded like it could be a fun story. So so I went to this workshop, and it was just one scientist after another getting up to say their piece about all the stuff we've been talking about, why beavers were so important for water storage and water quality and salmon habitat and, pollution filtration and so on. And so it was that conference in the Seattle suburbs that really radicalized me as a beaver believer. And I wrote a few articles about beaver restoration, and that ultimately resulted in in the book. So here I am, more than a decade later, still evangelizing about them. They've colonized my life, and I'm grateful for it.
And doing a great job of it. If there's not any other questions, then we'll probably wrap up. This is your last call for a question. But just thank you so much, Ben, for coming to present, and thank you for everybody coming to listen to Ben. These are the kinds of things we love to learn about. And like I said earlier, these are the kinds of things that we would love for you to tell your neighbors about and talk to people about. And it takes our whole community coming together, really thinking about what makes our riparian ecosystems healthy, and getting people just on the same page and in that sort of mindset of it's not about us, it's about how can we make the environment a more healthier place. So if you'd like to say anything else, Ben.
No, just thank you again, Marcy, for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening. It's always inspiring to meet people who are so enthusiastic and passionate about these animals. So thank you all for the work you're doing.
Absolutely. And I will send out to everybody a link to the presentation recording once I have it all compiled and uploaded for you to share out. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.